Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're cracking open a pretty dense set of source materials. We've got court documents, emails, texts, deposition bits,
Yeah, a real mix.
and we're doing a focused deep dive specifically into the communications within these documents. We want to see what they reveal, especially the messages that seem, well, concerning or that pop up in legal fights as evidence of potential wrongdoing.
Exactly. It's less about just the nuts and bolts of a business argument and more about, peeling back the layers. What are these real messages caught in the legal net tell us about intent, strategy, the relationships, and honestly, the kind of digital trail we all leave?
Our goal is to cut through it all for you. We want to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising details, and get you up to speed quickly on what these specific communications show in this particular legal context.
And the context here is a court case involving payment processing companies. We're looking specifically at messages flying back and forth between people at Shift4 and Card Connect, which is now part of Pfizer, so it's a direct look at how things break down.
Okay, let's jump right in. The sources paint a picture of a fundamental disagreement at the heart of this. Seems to be about what kind of business and how much Shift 4 was supposed to bring over to Card Connect.
That's spot on. Based on what we're seeing in sources like 2170 and 2172, Card Connect definitely seemed to believe there was an understanding, maybe not a perfectly signed-off contract on this point, but a real expectation that Shift4 would move a significant chunk of its enterprise business their way.
Enterprise business. Okay, maybe break that down quickly. Why is enterprise the magic word here?
Good question. So in payments, enterprise usually means your big clients. They get national chains, large online stores, major brands. They process way, way more transactions than, say, a local shop.
Right, much higher volume.
Exactly. Higher volume, often more complex needs, but crucially much more revenue for the processor. So getting enterprise clients is a big deal. And Card Connect, according to these documents, thought that's what they were getting from Shift4, and they based their pricing on that assumption.
Okay, so Card Connect is expecting these big, high-volume accounts, but Shift 4, they saw it differently.
Completely differently. The same sources, 2170 and 2172, they quote Shift4's position pretty bluntly. All enterprise merchants were off limits to Card Connect.
Wow. Off limits. That's not a small difference in understanding.
Not at all. It's a chasm. If one side thinks they're getting the most valuable clients and the other side thinks those clients are absolutely not part of the deal, well, you can see the conflict brewing right there.
And this wasn't just theoretical, right? The communications show it hitting the bottom line.
Oh, definitely. The emails and texts cited in those sources, 2170 and 2172, they get specific. They talk about pricing models, expected transaction volume. There's a figure like $400 million mentioned for annual volume.
400 million. Okay.
And they even calculate the profit impact. Something like $150,000 in monthly profit that Card Connect was presumably expecting based on that volume. So these weren't vague hopes. They were tied to concrete numbers.
So from Card Connect's perspective, if that big enterprise volume wasn't showing up, it must have felt like Shift 4 wasn't holding up their end of the bargain.
That's the picture painted in the sources, yes. The feeling described from Card Connect's side in 2170 and 2172 was that maybe Shift4 was just cherry picking, sending over smaller merchants, maybe easier ones, but not delivering the core enterprise business that the whole deal, especially the pricing, was supposedly built around.
The sources also mention Shift4's existing relationship with First Data, which ironically is now Fiserv, Card Connect's parent company. How did that play in?
Well, the understanding, as laid out in the documents, was that Shift4 was supposed to be moving business away from its other processors, potentially including First Data, and onto Card Connect's platform.
Ah, okay.
So Card Connect likely priced the deal, thinking they were winning this big chunk of business, including valuable enterprise accounts from a competitor, possibly even their own future parent company's network. If that volume didn't materialize, Card Connect's whole financial rationale for the deal would be undermined.
There's a specific merchant mentioned, Moxie. Why does that one name pop up in sources 2170 and 2172?
The Moxie example seems to be used in the documents as a kind of case study for the broader problem. It highlights just how messy things came practically, like difficulties figuring out who was actually processing Moxie's transactions, how to apply the agreement terms to this specific merchant. It shows the real-world friction behind the high-level disagreement about enterprise volume.
Makes the abstract fight very concrete.
Exactly.
Did Shift 4 have a counter-argument on why things weren't clear, according to the sources?
Yes. Documents 2170 and 2172 mention Shift4 claiming they didn't have no transparency. They argued they couldn't properly see which merchants were actually active on Card Connect's system.
So they couldn't verify things.
That was their claim, yeah. That this lack of visibility made it hard, maybe impossible, for them to confirm which merchants had moved, whether enterprise clients were there, or if the volume matched expectations. Another point of friction.
You know, sometimes what's not in the documents is revealing too. The sources point to a missing attachment, shift4.docs. Why highlight something that's missing?
That's interesting, right? So sources 2170 and 2172 specifically flag this missing attachment. It gets mentioned in a text message, and the context implies it was probably the key proposal or document outlining Shift4's plan or view on the whole enterprise business thing.
So a potentially crucial piece of the puzzle is just gone from the record we have.
Gone from the record presented in these sources, yes. But the mention of it in a text that is evidence becomes significant. It highlights a gap. What did that document actually say? Was it a formal proposal? Did it confirm Shift4's no enterprise stance or something else? Its absence becomes something lawyers can argue about based on the surrounding messages.
Okay, so that's the business backdrop. Let's shift to the more direct legal allegations. Source 2398 summarizes the first amended complaint. What specific breaches were alleged against Shift4?
According to Source 2398, the complaint listed several ways Shift4 allegedly breached their agreements. Key ones were failing to provide a formal list of merchants. They were supposed to convert the conversion list.
Okay.
Failing to actually use commercially reasonable efforts to get those merchants moved over, and failing to start paying a higher monthly fee that was agreed upon after a certain transition period ended. That date was June 30, 2019.
So there was a deadline for the transition and the money changed after that.
That's what the complaint alleges, based on Source 2398. A window to move the merchants, and then a new payment structure kicked in, presumably because Card Connect expected the revenue from those moved merchants by then. So not moving the merchants and not paying the higher fee was alleged as a double breach.
And the numbers. Source 2398 mentioned a lot of merchants didn't get moved.
Yeah, the numbers cited are pretty stark. Source 2398 says that by March 2020, nearly a year after that transition deadline, something like 960 merchants who were supposed to move reportedly hadn't.
Wow, 960.
And only about 24 had apparently moved without some kind of conversion fee, suggesting most migrations either didn't happen or involved extra costs not originally planned for, according to the complaint. It really backs up the claim about lack of reasonable effort.
But it wasn't just failing to move merchants, right? The complaint also alleges Shift4 actively went after merchants they shouldn't have. Improper solicitation.
Yes, that's a major focus in Source 2398. The settlement agreement apparently had a specific clause, paragraph 3, prohibiting solicitation. The complaint alleges Shift4 didn't just passively fail to convert, but took affirmative acts to improperly solicit merchants who were supposed to be Card Connects or handled only through the agreed migration process.
Affirmative acts, like what? What did they allegedly do?
Source 2398 claims these acts included things like sending emails directly to merchants who were specifically carved out, meaning off-limits for solicitation, according to the deal. The allegation is Shift4 contacted these merchants, charged them fees, and tried to pull them onto Shift4's platform directly, essentially poaching them in violation of the non-solicitation agreement. The argument is these merchants wouldn't have heard from Shift4 otherwise.
And this is where we get into specific, really concerning communications presented as evidence. There's a text message exchange that gets highlighted.
Yes, Source 2349 points to texts between Taylor Lober and J.D. Oder. Lober texts, and I'm quoting from the source here, "I am starting to be able to convert some of the tavern folks, Card Connect and COC."
Tavern folks, assuming that means tavern or restaurant bar merchants.
That seems the likely interpretation, yeah. And identifying a specific merchant type like that makes the communication feel very concrete, linking it directly to alleged business action.
In the language, Card Connect and COC? That's incredibly blunt and hostile.
Extremely. It's raw, aggressive language directed squarely at the competitor. Legally, that kind of statement isn't just unprofessional. It can be used to argue intent. Was the conversion of these tavern folks part of a hostile strategy? This text suggests it might have been.
What was J.D. Oder's response to this message about converting tavern merchants and the F-bomb?
According to Source 2349, Oder's reply was simply, "Hell yes, brother."
Hell yes, brother. So basically, enthusiastic approval.
Absolutely. It reads as a strong endorsement of both the action, converting the tavern folks, and the sentiment, Card Connect. So you have this short exchange presented as evidence, identifying specific merchants, expressing hostility, and getting an immediate positive green light. That's powerful stuff when alleging improper intentional solicitation.
And Source 2398 emphasizes the complaint framed these actions as intentional and without privilege or justification, meaning Shift 4 allegedly knew exactly what they were doing and that it was wrong.
Right. That framing is key legally. It suggests this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate strategy to interfere with Card Connect's business relationships, knowing they were protected by the agreement.
Okay, let's broaden out a bit. The sources also show communications revealing more general strategic thinking, sometimes framed in very aggressive terms.
Yes, this part of the source material is fascinating, almost like getting a peek inside a playbook. Source 2456, for example, presents a document or list titled Our Rules of Engagement.
Rules of engagement. That definitely sounds militaristic for a business context. What rules are we talking about?
They're quite something. The list in Source 2456 includes things like never get caught, always look innocent, never talk inside the organization, always work in small teams.
Wait, never get caught, always look innocent.
Yes, and it continues. Always be well prepared, always be on time, be spontaneous and creative, don't make unnecessary enemies, never give up, maintain the highest degree of discipline, know your enemy, and always be planning.
Pairing never get caught and always look innocent with business tactics.
That immediately raises some red flags, doesn't it? What does that suggest about the kind of engagement they had in mind?
It strongly suggests a mindset viewing business competition less as sport and more as, well, conflict. Maybe even covert operations. Rules like never get caught imply activities that shouldn't see the light of day. Always look innocent suggests maintaining a facade. Never talk inside the organization hints at secrecy, even internally. It frames business in a very clandestine, almost adversarial way.
And there was a what we need to do list alongside these rules.
Correct. Source 2456 include related action items that really amplify that adversarial tone. Things like
Yeah.
compile exhaustive lists of the enemy organization's leadership, their weaknesses, strengths, how they operate, gather detailed personal background info, identify their business partners, and this one's a kicker, identify every conceivable way to undermine enemy objectives, recruiting, etc.
Enemy organization, every conceivable way to undermine. That's not just competing, that sounds like trying to actively dismantle a rival. It could certainly be interpreted that way, and you can bet lawyers would present it like that. Using terms like enemy organization and planning to undermine objectives using personal background info. It points towards a highly aggressive, potentially destructive strategy far beyond normal market competition. Legally, it could be evidence of predatory intent or a culture encouraging rule bending.
And this wasn't an isolated case of aggressive language. Source 2189 mentions a battle plan.
That's right. Exhibit 69, cited in Source 2189, apparently contains an email chain where they explicitly discuss devising a battle plan. It just reinforces that military or conflict framing seen in the rules of engagement.
The sources also capture reactions to market shifts, like when First Data acquired Card Connect. How did Shift 4 leadership view that, according to Source 2189?
Source 2189 shows Jared Isaacman and Frank Young seeing it immediately as a major opportunity. The messages apparently show real excitement, like how can we use this? Isaacman is quoted saying something like, we need to be all over this and have a strategy Monday, This could be huge. They have thousands of merchants.
So a competitor gets acquired, and their first thought is, how do we go after their customers?
Pretty much. It reveals an opportunistic mindset, seeing potential disruption from the merger as a prime time to aggressively target the combined company's merchants, especially any they might share. The urgency strategy Monday shows they saw it as a big, immediate opening.
And there was a Project Apple mentioned in Source 2469. What was the goal there?
Source 2469 indicates this was an internal presentation, maybe a PowerPoint. It listed strategic goals like becoming the biggest player, boosting market presence, standard stuff. But it also explicitly included the goal of eliminating a competitor.
Eliminating a competitor, not outcompeting or gaining share, but eliminating. That sounds final.
It's very strong language, yes. To state the goal is eliminating. A competitor goes beyond typical business strategy talk. In a legal fight, that phrase in an internal document could be presented as evidence of intent to harm or drive a rival out of business, supporting claims of aggressive or unfair practices.
Did the communications also touch on navigating legal agreements like non-competes?
They did. Source 2456 specifically mentions messages discussing getting around the non-compete. It even includes a text where Jared Isaacman asks Taylor Lavery about potentially starting a whole new company, specifically as a way to bypass a non-compete agreement.
Wow. Openly discussing creating a separate entity just to sidestep a contract.
That's what the source indicates, yes. Communications like that, exploring ways to get around legal obligations, are gold for the opposing side in a lawsuit alleging breach of contract. It suggests awareness of the rule and a deliberate attempt to circumvent it, rather than an honest mistake.
Okay, now, we need to tackle some really difficult content from the sources. There's language here that is highly unprofessional, offensive, and sometimes even threatening. And just to be absolutely clear for everyone listening, we are reporting on this because it is presented as evidence in the legal sources provided. We are not endorsing any of these views or this language. The sources do include politically charged content, including racist language, and we're reporting it impartially as it appears.
Right. This is a tough section. But this language is in the exhibits, presumably presented to show intent, character, or maybe the general culture within the communications. Sources 2461, 2463, and 2469 are filled with examples of really harsh, derogatory, and profane language.
Can you give some examples just so people understand the level we're talking about?
Sure, the documents cited mention things like calling people fucking crooks, scumbags, a text saying kill all those motherfuckers, referring to individuals as a thug or a loose cannon. There's even mention of someone allegedly having cursed one of our largest clients. So not just internal sniping.
That's already way beyond professional norms. But recorded in texts and emails, it takes on legal weight.
Absolutely. Language like that, even if said informally at the time, becomes hard evidence when it's written down. It can be used to show hostility, question someone's judgment, or paint a picture of the environment.
And it gets worse. The sources point to explicitly offensive language, including racism.
Yes. Source 2461 is very specific here. It references Exhibit 94, page 140, which reportedly contains a text message from J.D. Oder II. According to the source, that text states, "So some nigger rigged it up."
That's a direct racial slur, presented as evidence.
Correct. Source 2461 notes there's an image of the message in the exhibit, making it verifiable within the court record. The source also mentions that when asked about it in a deposition, J.D. Oder II reportedly didn't recall using the word. But the text itself exists as evidence, according to these documents.
Are there other examples related to identity?
Source 2461 also cites texts discussing someone being a Jew, and even one saying, "Fire the Jew." It's shocking. Additionally, there are references to personal things like Viagra, Cialis, and crude sexualized language like mentioning sluts in the room above us. It's a pattern of deeply unprofessional and offensive communication across various categories captured in these exhibits.
And it crosses into threats, too.
Source 2461 mentions texts containing direct threats, including the phrase, "I will kill him." Obviously, any communication like that is incredibly serious and would be treated as such legally, potentially showing extreme hostility or intent.
It's really stark how this kind of language, once captured digitally, becomes evidence that can speak volumes in court about intent, character, or the whole company culture.
It's a raw look at the human side, isn't it? The anger, the frustration, maybe things said in the heat of the moment. But once it's written and discoverable, it has potentially huge legal consequences.
Let's switch tracks slightly to communications about technology and data. These also seem concerning, especially in a fight over who gets which merchants.
Right, this involves some technical details. Source 2330 shows text messages between people identified as JJR and TM talking about something called a token extraction tool.
Token extraction tool. Okay, quick refresher. Tokenization and payments. And why is extracting tokens a potential issue?
Sure, tokenization is basically a security thing. Instead of storing or sending the actual credit card number, you replace it with a unique, meaningless code, a token. You use the token for transactions so the real card number stays safe.
Makes sense.
An extraction tool implies something designed to pull these tokens out, maybe from where they're stored or used, like on a payment terminal.
And the texts specifically mention putting this tool on certain terminals, VX805s.
Exactly. Source 2330 quotes texts from JJR asking things like, "When can I install your token extraction tool on those terminals?" And then specifically, "Can I install the tokenization extraction tool on your VX805? They even discuss coordinating the install.
So why would talking about extracting tokens from terminals be a red flag in this kind of legal dispute?
Well, think about it. If you're fighting over who gets to process for certain merchants, getting the payment tokens associated with those merchants could potentially let you redirect their transactions maybe, or make it easier to move them to your platform. If those VX805 terminals belong to disputed merchants, discussing token extraction could be presented as an attempt to improperly access their payment data or take control of their processing relationship. It raises major security and control questions.
Got it. Then there was another communication, this time an email, about getting a list of all active merchant IDs or MIDs.
Yes, source 2381 describes an email from Frank asking Barry, and maybe Mike, for an estimate on how long it would take and cost for Pfizer to pull a report of all active MIDs. And critically, it specifies including those boarded through a third party.
Including those boarded through a third party. Why is that phrase potentially significant here?
Because in this context, third party could very likely mean merchants originally brought in by Shift4 or another partner, but now processing on Fiserv's platform. Asking for a list that explicitly includes those MIDs suggests wanting a comprehensive view, potentially including the very merchants at the center of the dispute.
And why is getting a full list of MIDs, especially those partner-boarded ones, such a big deal in a fight like this?
The MID is basically the merchant's unique account number with that processor. A full list is like having the keys to the kingdom. You know exactly who is processing on the platform. In a dispute about who moved, who didn't, who was improperly solicited, having that list would be incredibly valuable. You could identify targets, track conversions or lack thereof, understand the full scope of the relationship. It's sensitive competitive data, so emails about extracting it would definitely catch attention in court.
Okay, shifting again. The sources also bring up communications related to potentially high-risk merchants, specifically mentioning Kratom.
Right. Source 20469 discusses how legal filings apparently link terms like drug trafficking and even a sovereign citizen group to some of Jared Isaacman's texts.
Whoa, drug trafficking. That sounds extreme. What's the actual context according to the source?
The source, 2469, clarifies this. It says the drug trafficking reference in the legal filing actually relates specifically to merchants who were selling Kratom.
So the link is to Kratom sales, not something else.
That's what the source explains, yes.
Yeah.
And it adds important nuance. Kratom's legal status is complicated, not illegal everywhere, but often considered high risk by payment processors due to regulations, FDA warnings, chargeback risks, etc. So the allegation described in Source 2469 isn't necessarily about federal crimes, but that Shift4 allegedly knowingly boarded these high-risk Kratom merchants, possibly misrepresenting them, in violation of agreements or rules about handling high-risk businesses.
Ah, okay. So it's less about Kratom itself and more about whether they followed the rules for boarding high-risk businesses, which Kratom falls under.
It's about alleged knowing violation of policy. And the sources present exhibits to back this up. Exhibit 15, mentioned in Source 2469, apparently shows texts discussing risk and includes a specific construction telling someone not to add merchants selling Kratom.
So an explicit "don't do this."
That's what Exhibit 15 suggests, according to the source.
Mm-hmm.
But then Exhibit 17, also mentioned, is presented as containing a direct request for info on boarding more Kratom merchants.
So instruction "don't do it," followed by an inquiry about doing more of it, that doesn't look good side by side.
It's presented as potentially conflicting evidence, maybe showing disregard for the instruction. And then Exhibit 20, also noted in Source 2469, reportedly contains actual merchant applications listing Kratom as a product, proof that these businesses were being boarded and their nature was potentially known.
So the combination, the instruction, the inquiry, the applications, builds a case for an alleged knowing violation of the high-risk rules.
That seems to be the argument presented through these exhibits, according to the source, that there was awareness and maybe a decision to proceed anyway, despite rules or agreements classifying Kratom sellers as high risk or prohibited within the partnership.
The sources also mention emails talking about cartel and a text about Colombia, source 2469, near these Kratom exhibits. Any more detail on that?
Not much detail in the summary source, but their inclusion alongside the Kratom stuff suggests they're being used to contribute to a general narrative about discussions touching on high-risk or legally gray areas, even if the exact context isn't fully explained. They sort of add to the atmosphere.
Right, finally, let's look at how the legal process itself starts showing up in the communications. The fight moves from business emails to lawyers getting involved.
Yeah, you see the shift. Source 2189, for example, notes someone acknowledging receipt of a formal cease and desist letter. That's a clear legal shot across the bow, and acknowledging it internally shows the legal reality setting in.
There's also that email about termination that mentions unclean hands.
All right, Source 1604 have an email discussing whether to pull the trigger on terminating the agreement. They bring up unclean hands. That's a legal idea where you might lose in court if you acted badly yourself. So they're internally weighing the legal risks of their own actions, showing awareness of how things might play out legally.
It sounds like lawyers were actively shaping communications at some point.
Definitely seems like it. Source 2349 give a great example. An email from J.D. Oder confirming a plan for a site visit, specifically because Pfizer's lawyers requested it be done via email. That's direct evidence of legal counsel guiding even operational communications, likely to create a clear paper trail.
And we see people being questioned about these messages later in depositions.
Source 2463 mentions deposition excerpts where people are confronted with these texts and emails. You see moments where someone denies sharing info that's right there in a text or says they don't remember being called a thug, even with the message as an exhibit. It shows how challenging recall can be under oath and how these captured messages become tools for questioning credibility.
And perhaps the most personal reflection of the legal pressure comes from those texts in Source 945.
That's a really striking one. Source 945 shows texts from Michael J. Isaacman to Jared Isaacman. Michael talks about feeling trapped between a rock and a hard place over potentially having to testify against Jared and the company.
Torn between family and the legal consequences.
Exactly.
Mm.
He mentions worrying about the family, but also worrying about the results if he doesn't testify. It's a raw glimpse into the immense personal pressure and difficult choices individuals face when business disputes turn into legal battles involving family or close colleagues.
Wow. Okay, stepping back from all these details.
Hmm.
This deep dive really underscores how much gets captured in our digital communications, the business disagreements, the aggressive strategies, the personal conflicts, the offensive language, especially when it ends up under a legal microscope.
It really does. These sources offer this sometimes uncomfortable but very direct window. You see how arguments over contracts play out in real, often unfiltered messages. You see strategies being discussed, sometimes using language like battle plans or rules of engagement that sound pretty extreme.
And it's a stark reminder, isn't it, that every email, every text, even the seemingly casual ones with unprofessional or awful language, can become hard evidence. They aren't just throwaway comments. They get analyzed for intent, for character, for what they say about the whole environment.
Totally. These communications, fished out of discovery and presented in court, become this lasting record of the human side of the conflict. All the tactics, the emotions, the bad judgment calls, preserved digitally.
So for you listening, what's the takeaway here? In a world where everything we type can potentially be saved and scrutinized, what do these examples tell us about being intentional, about thinking through context and consequences before we hit send, especially when things are tense or the stakes are high?
And maybe think about those rules of engagement again. Concepts like always be well prepared, maintain discipline, know your enemy, or maybe know your counterpart. Could applying principles like preparation, discipline, and really understanding the situation be used constructively? Not for conflict, but for building clearer, more transparent, more trustworthy communication from the start, maybe avoiding these kinds of blow-ups altogether.
Definitely food for thought about the power and permanence of our words in this digital age. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.